Welcome to the Mind of Business Success podcast. I'm your host, Alicia Cramer. Our guest today is Kimberly Spencer. Let's talk about transformation. Welcome to the
Oh,
show, Kimberly.
my favorite topic, transformation. It's a never-ending cycle. The only thing consistent is transformation, should you choose it. And even
Very
should you
true.
not, what I've found is then you transform, but it's unconsciously and into something that you don't particularly want in
Mhm.
life or your
Sometimes a
circum.
little more of the same.
Yeah, or then a little more of the same until the same becomes something that is
Unbearable, right?
bearable. Exactly.
So let's start by talking about transformation and what you're doing with your business so our listeners have a little bit of a background on you and they get a sense of who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm in the business of transforming people's stories with through my coaching business, and then I have a second business where I'm in the business of leveraging other people's stories to transform more people's stories. And I've always been in this business at the through line through a very varied career because I didn't start out as a coach and I didn't start out as an agency owner. I started out actually as a screenwriter in Hollywood that I thought was my dream. I thought that was like what I wanted to do. I had the dream come true, got the premiere, got the film made, and realized that it wasn't necessarily the process that I absolutely loved. But what I loved was learning that that film changed two people's lives, at least to my three actually to my knowledge. And it was a very niche film about something that most people look at me and they're like, princess, crown yourself, communication queens, hardcore bro motocross movie. Would never put the two together. And I actually just showed one of my clients the trailer, and she's never known me from that lifestyle and from 10 years ago. And she was like, wait, you wrote that? Like you that was the film you wrote? And I said, yes, that was, but it actually was the catalyst that led me into many opportunities. So I went from being a screenwriter to support myself in Hollywood. I was a Pilates instructor for 13 years and then had my own private brick and mortar Pilates business in Los Angeles. And then I also became partners with someone else who was retiring from the film industry in an e-commerce company. We took a startup product to market that was very utilized my Pilates background, and it was a back stretching chair. Took it to market, started pitching it to the first round of Shark Tank auditions. Got it featured up in New York Times Square and like grew that company, and then was devastated with my story when my business partner told me he wanted to buy me out. And I'd worked for 2 years in that company and had received nothing from it. And had put my heart and soul into investing into something that wasn't investing back into me. And it wasn't until we signed the buyout agreement 3 weeks before I got married, went off to Italy on my honeymoon, and I turned to my husband by about week 3 and was like, what do I do when I get back? Because I'd had all these iterations and fulfilled these dreams to a degree. And it had fulfilled it to the point where my curiosity was like, okay, what's next? What's that next transformation that I can evolve into? And I was looking at all the common denominators. If I'd always been interested in health and wellness, and I was a former pageant girl, and I loved business, and I loved relationships, and I loved all these pieces. And I looked at it, and I was like, what combines all of it? And after way too many espressos, oops, sorry about that. I'll just put that on Do Not Disturb. Um, After way too many espressos, I leaped off the couch and was like, crown yourself. And my husband's like, what's that? And I was like, I have no idea, but that's the name of my company. And so I immediately got to start working in all the things that now I see so many entrepreneurs start out with when what I call productive procrastination, where I was doing all the things to grow a business, to make a business really look good, like photo shoots, and got the nice domain name and registered the business. I didn't make sales for a year and a half in my business. And I realized then that it wasn't until I found out I was pregnant with my first son that the story that I was telling myself about why my business wasn't successful was a victim story that was filled with complaining and blaming and shame. And it was very parallel to the body shaming story that I'd had from over 10 years ago when I battled bulimia and got through that with no psychological or medical intervention. So I knew that it was a mindset piece that was blocking my ability to receive financial success and business success. And I also knew that because I found out I was pregnant, I had a 9-month deadline to get my shit sorted. And that was when I immediately got certified in NLP, timeline therapy, hypnosis, started learning all about the unconscious mind, and then started actually doing the actual work of business and making sales and having those conversations and doing those acts of courage that are required to grow anything.
Your story gives me goosebumps. So I just have to say that I also was a serial entrepreneur prior to starting my hypnotherapy practice, and that my hypnotherapy practice was the catalyst for me getting my shit together, was getting pregnant with my first son.
Oh,
So it's, it's one of those things where we have these dreams and these desires. We know it, we can feel it, right? And it is all of that subconscious stuff. It is our old story, our old self image that is more often than not the thing that is slowing us down or stopping us completely. And it is not until we address those things and, using your terminology, we transform ourselves, our self-image, we transform that story about ourselves, that we can begin to gain some positive traction and really start living in a congruent way with those dreams and those heart's desires.
Mm-hmm. It's fun. Kids are so magical at being the catalyst for transformation. Like I was telling my son the other day, I said, "Do you realize how magical you are?" And he's like, "I am?" And I said, "You transformed me into being a mom. Your brother didn't do that because he didn't come along until after." I said, "But your brother did transform you into being a big brother." And I think that that's looking at the stories of transformation, is it is our relationships that actually allow us to lean into the potentiality for transformation. Like I joke that my husband was my experiment in like total brutal honesty. I never thought, when I manifested him literally 2 hours after I said a prayer to the universe, I was like, I just want to be authentic and I want to travel. And 2 hours later, I meet this man and I'm like very interested, but I'm also like, have some battle scars. And I was like, I guess this is my opportunity to lean into being absolutely authentic and totally courageous. So I shared with him things that most men would run for the hills from, like with your, all the things that you're not supposed to do or not supposed to say when you're interested in someone. And I was just brutally candid. And that's been the foundation of our 10-year relationship now, going on 10 years, married for 8. Like that's the power of our relationships, is they do have the power to transform us when we allow them to be our teachers. Like so often when we default to old patterns and old relationships, whether it's our relationship with our body or our relationship with our children, where we project what we learned from our parents, or whether it's our relationship with our spouse or our relationship with our clients or customers, business partners, so often it's those relationships that allow us the mirror for what's really going on inside of us. And if we allow that to be our teachers and lean into being courageous, clear about what we want, understanding our boundaries, and being able, like, you don't know when your boundaries been violated, and you don't know what boundaries you necessarily have until somebody tests them. And then as parents, we know that like they're tested quite a lot when you have kids. And so then you see, okay, this is my boundary when it comes to discipline. This is my boundary when it comes to how I'm treated with respect. This is my boundary around how people speak to me and speak of me, and who I choose to spend my time with. And it's when those boundaries, when we're in relation with other people, and or in relation with ourselves and our own awareness of like who we are and where we're evolving.
It's powerful and it's really uncomfortable for a lot of people. I've seen it with my clients, and I'm sure you can speak to this as well. there is a tendency when we are in a situation where we're being triggered by our spouse or children or an employee or whatever it may be, the default is going into blame or going into the old story of injustice about how this is the reoccurring pattern in our life and it's not fair. And we get caught in that, and it takes that inner strength to be able to recognize that what is being triggered, that's within us, and our work can only be our own inner work. We cannot ask someone else to change who they're being so that they're not triggering the wound that we've got to heal within ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, couldn't agree more or have said it better, because that the only work that we can do is internally. And the beautiful thing though is when we transform our own stories, it actually transforms the paradigm of the relationship of what happens externally outside of us. So when we work that amazing magic, in essence, that is us transforming our own perceptions of how we perceive reality and the meanings that we attach to it, when we transform that, we actually change our relationship for what is triggering us in the first place.
I'm so excited that you said that, because it does sometimes seem like magic. And I always explain to my clients that while you can only do your own inner work, there is this phenomenon that frequently occurs where when you've created that shift within yourself, when you've released your negative emotion, your old trigger, the dynamic begins to change. The person who is disrespectful to you somehow becomes a little more kind and compassionate. I mean, we see this evidence, but we can't do the inner work purely from the place of trying to get the other person's behavior to change. We have to be willing to do it for ourselves, regardless of whether or not they change. And that, I think, is where the real magic is, because that's when the real shift occurs within us, when we stop coming from sort of those lower, more egotistical, places within ourselves, and we are able to elevate. And that's an elevation of our consciousness. It's moving from those lower emotions up into those higher emotions. And when that happens, it really can transform your relationships in such powerful, positive ways.
Yeah. And the beauty is when you look at that internal work, it all starts with ownership. And ownership and personal responsibility are not the sexiest things that people want to look at first, because it's very easy. It's like a biological default, actually, for us to blame. But if we can recognize where blame is, whether it's blaming the economy or blaming our kids for how, time constrained thus we are, or blaming our clients, or blaming our customers. Like I've seen all the forms of all the shades of blame. And ultimately, as lovely as it may feel in the moment, it does not give you long lasting transformation until you take personal responsibility and ownership for your part in the relational experience of what's going on. And when you can take ownership for how have I been perceiving this situation with money? How have I been perceiving this situation with the economy? How have I been perceiving this? Then you can take hold of that perception, because once you're consciously aware of it, then that unconsciousness that's kind of showing up externally isn't manifesting in chaos. It can manifest that you can, I don't like the word control, but that you can transform. When you are able to look at that perception of what does that mean to me? Like, what am I actually making this thing about money mean to me? Like, for example, I was on a call with a client the other day, and I said, what does money mean for you? And she was saying, oh, money means freedom and expansion. And I said, well, for the last session that we just had, like, you were complaining about your bank account and how it's so, how you've been struggling. And I said, so you may be saying all the right things, that freedom, that money means freedom and expansion, but why aren't you experiencing that? And she took a moment and she realized that even though she consciously wanted, there's a difference between wanting, like actually wanting to believe something and truly something. She wanted to feel the freedom and expansion of money. She actually was scared to lean in to growing her sales because she didn't want to take away the time from her kid. And so once we got to the root cause of like what that issue actually was, then her story around money was able to change. And she was like, oh, this is actually my new story. This is what I'm going to be creating. Like, this is why I've been limiting myself, what I've been doing. And it's just a strategy. It's not necessary. It's not who you are. So when we can de-identify from our strategies that have gotten us to the circumstances that we're in, and then look at how do we then transform that strategy, becomes something that's no longer like I'm a failure or I am struggling with making money or all those personalizations. And it can turn into, oh, I was using this strategy, well, let me just change the strategy. And then what she did was she started working and making offers from a place of, what will this do and provide for my son? Change the game.
We have a tendency to make our story very meaningful to us, right? I always encourage people to look at, there's usually I found two really big tripping points for people when they're really hung up on a limiting belief. And that is, what does it mean about me? So that's that story piece, right?
Yep.
And when we look at that, we can oftentimes find what's really going on there in the subconscious mind. There's usually that contradiction there between the part of you that wants that expansion and that freedom and the part of you that's holding on to this old story. It's complete BS, but until we actually see it for what it is, it still has its grip on us. And the other one is fear. And oftentimes fear is entangled with the first one, the story, right?
Yep.
Right? If I let this go, like in the case of your client, if I let this go, then I'm going to not be the mom that I want to be. And that's more painful to me than not having the money. And so now you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. But when we're able to actually see those things honestly and objectively, now we can see how ridiculous they are. And I always say there's always a better way than fear. Always.
Always. And I found there are three what I call Trojan horses that really sneak up in the form of fear. The first is safety and familiarity. We always want to go towards what's familiar and safe, even if it sucks. But if you're familiar, you've grown accustomed that your brain knows how to survive in those circumstances. So, like in the case of my client, she understood how to survive and that she could thrive actually if she backed herself up against a wall. And that's how she'd had success in the past. So I said, oh, you're just doing your strategy again. You're backing yourself up against a wall. Is this a strategy that you want to repeat? And once she realized, oh, I actually would prefer to not back myself into a wall to then have that skyrocketing success, then that's something that we can then work with. The second one is control. How is what you fear allowing you to actually have some semblance or perception that you have some control over something? And often, like I'm recovering control freak right here, so that was my jam. That was what I thought I could clamp down on. If I just controlled everything and plotted and planned out everything, then everything would be go great. That's not the case. It comes down to presence instead of control. Plan, yes. Prepare, yes. And be really present with what is so that you can be adaptable and flexible. And then the third one is always acceptance and acknowledgement. And so often our fears gain validation, which is a deep rooted craving that so many high achievers have. They get validation from other people. So, oh, I'm working so hard. We've seen it in the whole hustle culture where people are like, oh, you pulled a 16-hour day. I pulled an 18-hour day. Like, and there's that almost competition of how busy you are. And so you get validation from that. And you also can see it from body image too. So when you have an experience of like you try on a dress and you say a negative comment about yourself, but then your girlfriends are like, oh girl, no, you look amazing. Well, then that trains you do something if you say something negative about yourself, then you're going to get that validation, that egoic validation and confirmation. And so you then repeat the pattern. So you get rewarded for that negative behavior. And so the same is true in business. I mean, how often do we hear people complain about money or the economy, and everybody and their mother wants to validate you for that? They're like, oh yeah, business is really hard or sales are really slow. And it's very common for people to validate that, especially in tough economic times where people think that there's that. If you constantly hear the perpetuation of recession, 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 then that's getting into your unconscious mind, and it allows you to have something that's a commonality. And we don't like to feel outside of the pack. However, there's an old saying that, like, if you look at the way the world is going, maybe you want to walk the other way. And
find the pack that's thriving and allow yourself to associate with that pack.
find that pack, because there are always people that are making money in recessions. There are always, like, I mean, I just did a podcast on my podcast, The Princess and the Bee, that was about how the biggest companies that we use today, Uber, Airbnb, they exploded in last year's recession. Or not last year's, but the last recession. So who's to say that we can't do the same? Who's to say that, like, you are not sitting on the next $1 billion idea? You just got to get through the winter and prepare, plan, and be present with what is, instead of avoiding. And that's the biggest thing that happens when we're trying to control a situation. Typically, then we try to avoid the things that are uncomfortable for us. And that leads to a lot of pain in the long run.
So we've already talked about some pretty deep stuff. And I'm actually going to encourage our listeners to re-listen to this podcast because there are some really valuable takeaways. If you are hearing these things and they're resonating, and I can pretty much guarantee, because I know human beings quite well, we've all got this stuff. We're all doing the inner work, and allow yourself the opportunity to call yourself out on some of these things, because that is where the magic happens, right? So, because we don't have a whole lot of time yet, I want to make sure that we give a little bit of airtime about your podcast so that our listeners can be sure to check that out. And then, of course, we need to make sure that our listeners know how they can get in contact with you. So let's start with the podcast. And then can you also share with our listeners your website, where we can find you, how we can track you down and watch everything you're doing?
You can stalk me on the interwebs, not in real life, please. And so, yes, so the podcast is called The Princess and the Bee. It is all about the beliefs that we go through to become the queen bee of our lives. And so we are all evolving on that journey. And so the beliefs around body, business, boys, bank accounts, babies, all those beliefs that we see and experience, it tackles all of those different types of holistic beliefs, very holistic perspective. And then if you love this conversation, you can always head on over to crownyourself.com. That has all our social links. We're on all the socials at crownyourself.now. And if you want to get booked on podcasts and use your story to start transforming other people's lives, you can visit us at communicationqueens.com.
Love it. Okay, so now that we got the admin out of the way, every once in a while, I have a guest on like yourself who has an area of expertise near and dear to my own heart. Of course, I'm biased, right? But biased in a good way, because I know how powerful this work is. This is the same type of work that I'm doing with my clients. It has transformed my life and continues to do so. And so, as the subject matter expert, on the throne, I would love if you would share with us perhaps a takeaway, something that you feel inspired to end us off with that can maybe be exactly what someone needs to hear as they are going through their own transformational journey.
So, the greatest thing that I always would leave off with would definitely be take ownership of your story and also of what you're avoiding is part of that story. So, when you what is it that you're avoiding and not actually taking ownership of? Because that is where, when you have the courage to look at that piece, when you have the courage to look at piece that you're avoiding, that's actually where the transformation takes place, because courage is that tipping point vibrationally that leads you into those higher vibrations of what it is that you actually want to be creating. And it's so I challenge you lovingly to own your story, own your past, own your successes. It's a huge one for women. Own your failures, own your mistakes, own your mess, own your miracles, and look at what presently are you avoiding. And then from there, look at what is that thing that you're avoiding? What is it that you're making that mean about you? Because when you can look at what you're making, what you're avoiding mean something about you, then that gives you that's where the real magic happens, to own that, transform that, and make it mean something new.
Love it. Perfect way to end this segment. Thank you so much, Kimberly, for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Alicia. It was a true pleasure. And I am so excited to get to know you and your listeners more.
Well, speaking of our listeners, I've got to thank our listeners. We are doing this for you. If you have not already subscribed, make sure you do so. And until next time, we will see you in the next episode.